There we go. We're now recording. And let me go ahead and share screen. MySQL Workbench. All right, here we go. I'm going to make a new SQL editor here. Oh, you're not going to do this to me, are you? Oh, this done this to me before. How did I fix this? Where it's just giving me a tiny little editor window. Let me try making a new tab here. Nope. Sorry, folks. Hang on a second. Oh, that did it. All right, cool. So if it does that to you, one of these little interface buttons over here, I think this was the one. Got that back, where I took away the action output and then brought it back again. That fixed it. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the summary queries. And basically, these are functions that are used in aggregate functions, or these are the aggregate functions, actually. So let me go ahead and put some of these inside a comment here. So the ones that you're going to be seeing are one, average, AVG, where you want to take a series of numerical values and average them out. I haven't tested that I can recall whether you can do this with dates or other kinds of data, but you can certainly do them with integers or floating point numbers or something like that. There is a sum where you can add up numerical values. There is a min where it just returns the lowest value, the lowest non-null value, by the way. And same thing with max, where it will return the highest value from a set. And then what else we got? Count. And count just counts the number of, again, non-null values that are returned within a set. There's also this beast here, and this is probably the one you saw in chapter 1. I don't understand why it's not letting me do that. Why does everything have to break all the time? Maybe it's because it's in a comment, I don't know. But anyway, this guy here, instead of counting a certain number of values that are returned, it counts the number of rows that are returned. So it just means, count splat or count all. That's what you usually see if you just want to give me a count of the number of entries that you received. And by the way, it's the same one that shows up down in the action output, or not the action output, but yeah, actually in the action output where it says like 122 rows returned, same kind of thing. That's the count asterisk that you can use. So let me make sure, let's see, I've got AP selected, so I don't need to do it, but just in case you don't, remember our old friend, use AP. And then let's just start off by doing a select all from invoices. I think that's what I'm starting with. Yeah. So if I do select all from invoices, then here's where it shows me that there's 114 rows returned, and it shows all the different columns, and it gives me all the results down here. Anything less than 1,000 will return. So let's say I want to count the number of invoices that I have in here. Now, one thing that you could do, of course, is you could go down and count this auto-incrementing invoice ID, but that's not good because remember we talked about last time, you might have numbers skipped. If somebody got deleted, the other numbers don't shift, like 10 doesn't become 9 if 8 gets deleted or something like that, so that wouldn't do. So you'd want to actually use a count aggregate function. So let's go ahead and do it. So select, and we'll do the count splat, right? And let's do a column alias. So we've got something that's actually readable down here for the column. And let's call it invoices count. And we'll do a from invoices. Okay, so it's the same thing as what we did up here. Oops, I forgot to put the actual function in here. There we go. So we got a count and then this. So that's the difference between these, plus the fact that we've got a column alias for this. So let count splat as invoices count from invoices, and then run that guy and take a look here. So I've got one row returned, and that's it. It does not return the 114 rows and everything. It just gives me this one row. So you guys know, I mean, you can look ahead to where we're going. Sorry, I don't know how to deselect that. Let me run it again. There we go. MySQL wants the entry counts to be the same. It wants whatever is in one row, like the number of or whatever's in one column, the number of rows that gets returned has to be the same as the next number of rows that gets returned in the next column. If you return 10 rows in one column and 15 rows in another column, it's going to complain at you. It's going to throw an error message and say, hey, I can't work like this. I need to have these be the same. Otherwise, it's just no good. So when we add another column to this, we're going to have to use another aggregate function there. We're going to have another summary query for that other column, or else it's no-go, because you'll have 114 rows in one column and one row in another column, and as we know, MySQL doesn't like that. So let's go ahead and try it here. Let's do another one here. I'm going to do, and we'll do from invoices again. And let's do the same thing. Let's do count, splat as, what did I call it up here? Invoices total, invoices count. And then let's say I also want to have invoice ID, right? So we already know what happens if we do select invoice ID from invoices. We'll get 114 rows, except it'll just be the one column. We know what happens if we do this one. We get one row. So let's go ahead and try it and see if we get an error message. And no, we didn't. It actually automatically, that's interesting. Let's try doing something different here. Let's do, instead of invoice ID, let's do invoice total. It's like it automatically grabbed the last one. See the invoice ID of 114? So I think it's automatically rolling it up and just one after another giving us the invoice number. So it just winds up giving us the invoice ID of the last one. I was not expecting that. And here, this is also not giving me an error. Hang on just a second. I'm just going to go right over here. I just want to test this out real quick, if you guys don't mind holding on for just 2 shakes of a lamb's tail here. Blah, 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 and invoice total. And so this is interesting. I've got MySQL Workbench running on my Mac over here, and when I run that, like this exact, I think it's this exact one, this exact example, I'm getting an error message, error code 1140, and it's basically saying, yeah, you have an unaggregate or non-aggregated column in invoice total. So it's actually throwing an error there, and here, instead of throwing an error, it's giving us like one of the invoice totals, I presume the last one. Let me select all from invoices and check it out here. So let's see, invoice total, and actually it's giving us the first one. It wrote all the way down until it got to the end. So that's interesting. Like I said, I was not expecting that. I'd be curious to have you guys try it on your machines and see what you wind up getting, because on my other machine, it's definitely winding up as an error. So even if it doesn't wind up as an error, like there must be different settings, the preferences or whatever on this machine. I'll have to check that out. Even if it doesn't get an error, it'd be hard to predict what it was going to spit out here, and so it's probably not something you want to do. You want to go ahead and make sure that you've got an aggregate function in all of your columns. That's not something I expected to go wrong. Interesting. So anyway, let's pretend it went wrong, and let's go ahead and put an aggregate function here. So if we did something like, count splat as invoices count, and then instead of doing just invoice total, let's do sum invoice total. And we'll use the as keyword here for column alias, and we will call it invoices total. Notice the difference between your invoice total versus invoices total. That's something you see quite a bit. If it was the same, or if it were the same, if someone said, yeah, I want you to call the new column invoice total, then you'd have to put quotes around it to distinguish the two and make sure that MySQL understood that this is something other than what we're originally pulling from the base table there. But if it's invoices total, it's something a little bit different, then it'll work. So we got invoices count and we've got invoices total, and we'll run it. And here we got the invoices count here, 114 invoices, and they add up to a grand total of $214,290.51. Okay. So with a slight detour there, we managed to get that example out of the way. Let's go ahead and just show like nesting some of these functions here. So let's say that, I don't know, your content manager is a very literal person and they really want to see a dollar sign in front of this. You can nest functions, or I guess it's kind of like composing functions where you have one value returned from an inner function, which then returns another value from the outer function. So let's say that we put this sum here into a concat function. Now concat is not an aggregate function, right? It's a string function. But we can put this, let's see, I'm going to concat a dollar sign in front of this, and then the sum of invoice total. And then don't forget, when you do that, you have to have the same number of closing parentheses as you have opening parentheses, right? So here one function opens, the concat function, the nested function opens sum, nested function closes, but we don't have concat closing over here. And we'll get an error message if we do this. Pretty sure. So let's go ahead and make sure to get that second one in there. And we'll hit Control Enter, and there we go. So now we're getting the invoices total with the dollar sign in front of it. And let's do another one here. Let's do something where we got a triple nested function here. I'm going to do a, instead of a sum, let's do an average here. An average of invoice total as invoices average. And don't forget the comma up here. You need a trailing comma in between this list of expressions here. And let's see, the average, I want to also concatenate with dollar. Well, let's do this one at a time. Let's do the average invoice total and hit return here. And then, okay, so this is the average. So before we do the concat, let's go ahead and round this, right? So right now over here we've got 51 cents. Over here we've got 74.1316. So we're going to start a pi operation here. And so we'll go ahead and do it a round on this one. So this is another function. It's not an aggregate function. It's a math function. Don't forget to, again, we opened up two of these function parentheses, so you have to close with 2 here. And we got to give it a second parameter here. We have to tell it how many decimals we want this to round to. So comma, and then not 20, but 2 decimals. And you'll see what happens here. Instead of 7.741316, it'll just be 0.74. There we go. And then let's also do the concat thing here with the dollar sign. So these two functions will both nest inside of our concat as above. Stop it. Again, we'll do the dollar sign first. And now we've got 3 functions opening up with open parentheses, right? There's one concat opens, round opens, average closes, round closes, and we still need to close concat over here. So just if you ever start like nesting functions like this, just count them in. It's like having nested elements in HTML or something, right? They open in a certain order and then close in a certain order. So we'll just go ahead and run that, and there we go. Now we've got it in a format that our poor little content manager can understand, right? Okay, so these are nested functions. Here we've got 2 functions nested. Here we've got 3 functions nested. In this one, only the sum function is an aggregate function. In this one, only average is the aggregate function. Sum, round, and concat are not aggregate functions. Okay, let's go on and do some other aggregate functions here. What else do we have? We've got min, max, and I think those are the only 2 we haven't done yet. We'll do distinct at the same time. You guys have some experience with distinct when you do select distinct. You can use the distinct keyword here inside of an aggregate function as well, although it looks a little bit different because is inside the parentheses. So let's go ahead and do this. I'm going to do a select and from invoices as before. And let's go ahead and do a max aggregate function. And we're going to do invoice total. Sorry, I'll type slower. Invoice total. And let's give it a column alias here. Highest due, highest amount due would probably be better, but I'm feeling a bit finger fatigue over here. Okay, I'll go ahead and do it. There we go. That's what you would probably see. And then min invoice total as lowest amount due. And then let's do another count here. Vendor ID as, I don't know, number of vendors. Something like that from invoices. And let's go ahead and run it and see what happens. So again, these are aggregate functions, right? So I'm expecting to return only one row here. We'll have 3 columns. Highest amount due, lowest amount due, and number of vendors, and each one should run these operations on the entire set of results from invoices, because I'm not, limiting the result in any way with a where clause or anything like that. So control enter, there we go. There's the one row. The highest amount due, some poor company owes almost $40,000. Somebody else only owes $6, and then the number of vendors is 114. Does this seem wrong to anybody? You guys have looked at that vendors table, or the invoices table an awful lot now. Anything strike you as wrong about this? What does that number mean? You guys have come across this number before when you're doing select statements on invoices. Anybody remember?
It should be connected with vendor ID, correct?
Well, yeah, vendor ID is one of the columns. Sure, yeah. So 114 is the total number of invoices. Let's go ahead and go all the way up here again, and let's do a select all from invoices, and let's take a look. If I do the control enter here, and I'm getting 114 rows returned. But there aren't 114 vendors in here. You can see that some of these are repeated. There's 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, blah, 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 plenty of those, and so on. So it's not actually giving us how many invoices there are. It's just giving us the total number of everything in there. So what we're going to do here is we're going to say count and then use that distinct keyword like you guys used in the select clause, right? Select distinct. But now the keyword distinct has to be inside the parentheses here.
So nothing with you sees more during one day than during the whole life. That's why Tommy can never become a hero.
Somebody's got their microphone on and they're listening to something else. Thank you. So now it should give us a different number here. Instead of giving us the 114, it was down here, it should give us a smaller number here. So control enter, and a number of vendors is only 34, right? So that's what the keyword here does, the distinct. Let's go ahead and take it out and see again. 114, 34. So a big difference there. So that's how you use distinct when you're doing a count. It just gets rid of duplicates, right? Just like it did before in the select statement. Okay, cool. Let's see how we're doing here. We just did that, distinct, and we're already pretty much through that first section of stuff in chapter 6. This is all about just how to run these aggregate functions, what they do, how to work with them, in conjunction with each other, and so on. So let's go ahead and do the next section here, which is how to group and summarize data, or something like that. So this is using a couple of different clauses, one of which is group by, which is actually 2 words, just like order by is 2 words. It's kind of hard to remember. Like when I was learning, I always wanted to do order by, and likewise when I was learning group by, I wanted to do group by. I never really figured out why they don't do it like that, but they're 2 different words, but they're used together. And then having. So having, as we'll discover, is a lot like the where clause. It's a way of running a filter on the results, right? It's a way of limiting the number of results that you get by running a certain condition or conditions against your query. So the difference between having and where is that where works on the base tables, which is the tables that you're querying to begin with, and having operates on the results table. So this grid that shows up down here, that's what having is operating on. So it's operating after the select has been made, basically. So let's go ahead and let's do this. Let's go ahead and do a select. I'm going to stick with invoices for right now, and maybe I'll be able to do that the whole time. Let's see. So select from invoices, and we're going to do the sum, which we just did, of invoice total as invoices total. So it's something that we just did a few lines up there. So as a reminder, this is what happens. We get a single row here, and it adds up the sum of all that stuff. So let's say that I want to have a vendor ID on this. If I do this, and as we've discovered, this doesn't seem to throw an error here, although it does on my other machine, which is extremely odd. But let's say I want to do an order by, and basically what that does is it says, okay, instead of giving me a total invoice amount for like all the rows, give me a total invoice amount for each vendor. Now, as we've discovered, there are only like 34, 35 vendors, whatever that number was, right? So I want to have like that number of results, like 34, 35 results, the vendor ID in the second row, and in the first row, it's going to be the sum of their invoices, just for that vendor ID. So here's how you would do that. You'd have the sum here, which is a summary query, and then vendor ID from invoices, and we'll go ahead and throw an a group by clause at the end of this. So it goes after the from clause. Group by vendor ID. And what this will do is basically it'll take every invoice total that it gets that corresponds with vendor ID, and it'll group them all together by adding them up as a sum function. So let's check it. Control enter. It's giving me 34 rows. For vendor ID owes an invoice total of $1,200.12. Vendor ID of 37 owes this much in total, and so on and so forth. So it's adding up all of them for each. Now there's another kind of fun thing that I'll go ahead and show you right now because I'm likely to forget later on, which is with rollup. So what you can do is you can get the sum of all this stuff for each vendor here, and then you can also get it to add everything up for you, and you don't have to do a bunch of extra queries. You can just type in with rollup here. Notice it says 35 rows returned this time instead of 34. So here's all the stuff that we had, and then if I scroll down to the bottom here, there's one row that gives me a very large number and the other one shows up null. This is adding up all of these guys together. So it's giving me that original 214,000 whatever and 51 cents, in addition to giving me the amount for each vendor there. So that's what with rollup does. It just takes everything, and if it can find a column that it's capable of adding up and giving you a total, then it'll do so. As you can see, it didn't know what to do with vendor ID, so it just threw a null value in there. So that's with rollup. There is either one or two exercises at the end of the chapter that you have to use with rollup in order to solve them, at least to solve them easily. I mean, this kind of stuff can be done without using with rollup, but it gets a lot more complicated. So it can be a happy thing to have that in there. Okay, so with rollup, now these guys, the group by goes before, it goes after the from clause, but before the order by clause. So let's say we wanted to do an order by, it would go down here at the end still. It's basically, as far as I can recall, with these simple queries at least, it's always order by and then limit on like the last two. So if you're trying something and you're getting an error, try putting your sorting down here at the very bottom. So order by, I don't know, invoices total. Let's do descending, so we get the highest number up top there. And there we go. There's the biggest number. Oh, you know what? It threw the, I was not expecting that. It threw the roll-up number up here. But I guess that makes sense because it's order by operates after the table has been rendered basically, and then it just reorders it. So I guess the order by clause has no idea that this is a roll-up row. It's just kind of treating it like any other row. So anyway, it threw in the roll-up sum here first, and then the rest of them going down from there. Okay, any questions so far? Let's do the having clause. We're gonna get through this pretty quickly here, I think. Just double checking and make sure I'm not skipping anything. Yeah, okay, let's do the having clause. Might as well run on the same thing here. Although maybe I'll copy and paste it down here without the with rollup just to simplify things. So I'm grabbing this guy here. And I'm going to do another query, just a slightly simple one, without the with rollup and without the order by. And let's do having here. So it goes with the group by generally, but it doesn't actually have to. I think that I pretty much always see it, group by vendor ID and then having. But again, it doesn't have to be. Each of these can be used on their own. So let's go ahead and check it here. So let's say I want to run a query. I want to run a condition, and I only want to see the invoices totals that are more than, say, $100. Let me go ahead and run this query so we can get our original back again here. So it's just going to get anything more than $100. Yeah, I've got some here smaller than that, $17.50 and so on. So let's go ahead and do a having. So down here, group by vendor ID and then having, and we're looking for the sum of invoice total. So I'll copy this guy. Having sum invoice total is greater than 100, right? And if I hit Control Enter, I should get a smaller number of rows here. And I'm getting 28 rows. Yeah, so it knocked out everything that was less than $100. So I just want to point out the difference here. Just a moment. Yeah. The difference here between where and having. Having, as I've said, operates on the result grid and not on the base table, not from the source table. That means that we can actually reference these column aliases, because the column aliases, invoices total, this is part of the result grid, right? So instead of completing, like restating this expression down here, I can just put in invoices total is greater than 100, and it'll work the same way. It's giving me the same 28 rows there, even though this is a column alias here and not a column in the original base table. So I'd like to jump back to chapter 3 for just a moment and recall that we had something like this, where we did like select and our old friend invoice total minus payment total minus credit total, when you guys were hoping you were never going to see again, is greater than 0, right? Or no, actually, let's do an as instead. So we did something like as, and what did we call it? Balance due. And then from invoices. And I think this was actually one of the chapter 3 exercises, was this or something like it. And we had to do a where clause. And what we wanted to do was where balance due is greater than 0, right? And we tried running that, and we got a big fat error message because, oh, whoops, sorry, credit total. See how useful these can be sometimes? And I'm still getting, it says unknown column balance due in the where clause. And so instead of doing it this way, we had to actually grab this whole expression here and paste it down in here, or type it over again, and then we can get it to work, right? But now you guys know a way that you don't have to do that. You know a way that you can use this column alias over here. And instead of using where, use having. Remember I said that having you almost always see along with group by, but it doesn't actually have to be. It can be anytime you run a condition on the result grid instead of the base table. So let's check it here. I'm going to do Control Enter, and it works. I get my 11 rows, and I didn't have to put the expression in there again. So this guy is handy. Now, I didn't want to let the cat out of the bag and let you guys know about this in Chapter 3 because you had to learn how to do it the other way. But now you know a better way. You can do it this way. So let's go ahead and start combining these into more complex queries. By the way, I just showed, before we do that, let me show you about, here's having that is being used without, group by. You can also use group by without, necessarily using an aggregate function. Like these are summary queries up here, right? They don't have to be summary queries in order for you to group things. So let's go ahead and do our select vendor ID from vendors. Now from invoices, like this, and as we see, we get the 114 rows. But if we want to get an actual list of the vendors that are in there without duplicates, I mean, we already know one way to do it, right? You can do select distinct in here, vendor ID. So that's one way. It gets you to the 34 rows. But I want to show you that you can actually do the group by here without it being an aggregate function, without it being a summary query, rather. So I'll do the group by vendor ID, and this by itself just gets the 34 rows. So it's just another way of doing the same thing, but I just want to show you that, yeah, group by you can do without it being a summary query, and then having can be used all on its own as well as that. So let's go ahead and do something a little bit more complex here, just to show you some of the stuff that you're going to be having to do when you do the Chapter 6 lessons at the end, where you're combining summary queries with inner table joins. So let's go ahead and do a select from invoices, and we're going to grab our sum of the invoice total as invoices total, and vendor name. So this should let you know right off the bat, if you've been paying attention to these tables in these different databases, particularly AP, that we're going to have to do a join here because invoices or invoice total is in the invoices table and vendor name is in the vendors table. So it's a piece of cake. Like all the different pieces just kind of fit together like Legos, right? It's just that it can be a little bit messy when you're first seeing something like this for the first time. And also it can seem messy when you're being asked to do something like this. The instructions can seem really complex. And it's like, oh God, how am I going to do this? But it's something to get used to because you will get, questions like this from content managers who are saying, okay, so how do I do X? And they'll give you some really complicated string of instructions and you're left kind of scratching your head going, oh gosh, I have to construct a query based on that. So sometimes they do get kind of, extensive like this. So I'm just going to go ahead and do a simple join. So from invoices I, and let's go ahead and join vendors V. And we already know what it's going to be on. It's going to be I.vendor ID equals v.vendor ID. And then we're going to have to group this together, right? So we want the invoice total for each vendor. So we'll do our old friend group by vendor ID. Actually, no. I almost made a mistake. I had, the last one we were using vendor ID, but we're actually pulling vendor name here. So we need to group by something that we're actually asking for here that's actually in the result table. So I'm going to group by vendor name like this. And let's do a halving here. So let's say I want to get only vendor. I only want to get invoices total that are more than $100. I don't care about the small fry there. So I'm going to do a halving so I can access that column alias name. And what do we call invoices total? It's greater than 100. And then let's go ahead and do an order by. And we'll order it by vendor name, just like we're grouping by. And let's do a limit 20. And there we go. It gets about 20 rows here. So here is, just want to show you what the query looks like. This is not a particularly long query, but it's not a real short one either. Looks like we've got about 10 lines of code in there. Maybe not, yeah, 9 lines of code. So be aware that you're going to have to do stuff like this at the end of chapter 6. And I believe that there's one where you even have to do a compound join, where you'll have to do like a join, invoice line items. And then another on, of course, on, whatever. So you'll wind up, I think it's like, it may be number 6 or number 7, you'll wind up with something that looks a bit like this, with a number of stuff in there. That's still nothing complexity-wise to what comes after that in like question 9 and 10 and so on. So this is your introduction to summary queries, aggregate functions, group by, halving, and yeah, I guess that was it. Nesting functions, here are your aggregate functions and that sort of thing. So it actually didn't take very long to go through this stuff. Nevertheless, I expect these questions, these exercises at the end of chapter 6 to be a little bit more difficult and time-consuming and involved than the ones at the end of chapter 5 were. So any questions at all about the stuff that we just went through from chapter 6, or questions about the assignment, which parts to leave out and so on? All right, very good. I will stop the recording.